Hi, I'm Mitch Gallagher from Sweetwater. When you're thinking about purchasing a mixer for your studio or your live rig, a question that always comes up is should you go with an analog mixer or should you go with a digital mixer? There definitely are benefits to each type. Let's take a look at the two types of mixers and how they compare. Before we begin talking about the differences between digital and analog consoles, let's talk a little bit about mixers in general and what they do that's the same. Because at their heart, all mixers do the same thing. They accept an incoming signal, whether it's from a microphone, a line level source, or an instrument level source. They process that by raising the gain up so electronics can deal with it. We may process the tone of the signal by adding EQ, we might add effects. And then we sum all those signals together to create a stereo or a multi-channel output. And we also send signals out to monitors and other destinations. So routing is a big part of what a mixing console does as well. So all mixers, whether you're dealing with an analog console like the Allen & Heath Z22 effects we have here, or a large format digital console like the Behringer X32, or a compact console like the digital Zoom L20 I have here to my right, they're all doing the same thing. But how they do what they do is where the features and the benefits come into play. Given that all mixers do basically the same thing, the differences become apparent when we start looking at how they accomplish those tasks and what your mindset is as you're working with the type of console that you have in front of you. With an analog console, it's very much a hands-on, instant access, instant gratification kind of a thing. With a digital console, you have that instant access, but you also have extended features that you can take advantage of. And this leads me to another point. With an analog console, we have a certain amount of processing on board, but we'll probably need to augment that with some additional external hardware to do things like adding effects, maybe add dynamics processing, and those kinds of things. With a digital console, a lot of that functionality is built in. So even though the price on a digital console may be a bit higher than with an analog console, you're oftentimes getting more in the box with a digital console than you do with an analog console. Conversely, you may not need all that processing power and you may want to have something that allows you to have a very fast workflow. In that case, an analog console is going to give you very instant access to all the features that you need. With a digital console, you'll have basic access to things in front of you, but on a channel by channel basis, you'll have to go into menus to access the different features. So to break it down even more, with an analog console, typically we have a separate knob, switch, or fader for each function. This means that once we learn a single channel strip, we know exactly where the gain is. We know exactly where the EQ is, and there's a separate knob for each of the EQ parameters. All of our aux ends have their own knobs. We have a pan control, we have a fader, and so on for each of the channels, and once we've learned one, that simply repeats across the console. So even though this looks intimidating, it's actually very simple because we're just repeating the same things over and over again. In the master section, we have dedicated controls for the left-right output. We might have aux master controls here. We might have a headphone control. So again, dedicated controls to each of those different functions. A digital console works in the same way, but to access the different features, you'll need to select through the channels. So for example, here, we can access 16 of our channels simultaneously and then bank to the second set of 16. So we have a total of 32 channels. Now when we select a particular channel, now we can access its preamp gain, the gate, the dynamics, the equalizer, aux ends, and so on. We can also access those different features using the screen. There are advantages to this and disadvantages. The disadvantage is that we can't see everything at once the way we can with an analog console. The advantage is that we can access a lot more parameters and a lot more functionality inside the console. With an analog console, a lot of the routing is preset. So our input comes in, goes through the channel, maybe we can assign that to the master left-right, maybe we'll have a subgroup or two, and we'll have some effect sends and things, but there's not a lot of configuring that has to go on. And this is the advantage. It's very simple. We don't have to do a lot of setup to get the mixer into action. But it's not as flexible as a digital console. We can't change the routing of, say, input 1 and bring it in on a different channel if we need to do that for some reason. So there are some limitations there, but the benefit, again, is that fast, easy access. With a digital console, we simply hit the routing button, and now we have a ton of flexibility for assigning any input to any output to route through different effects processors and so on. So if you need a lot of flexibility for various mixing scenarios, you can do that with a digital console. These days, both analog and digital consoles often have USB outputs for recording, and you can also often record to, say, an SD card. For example, this Z22 Effects has a USB output that can be used for recording and playback with a computer. With a digital console, like this X32, we can record using a card right on board, or we could route out to a computer. So again, we have a bit more flexibility there. And again, we can change our routing, so we can patch a microphone into channel 1 and route it to any track that we like. With an analog console, as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of visual feedback of what's going on here. We can see instantly where each of the controls is set as we look across the field of controls. And we have stereo meters here for looking at our levels. We can assign things using PFL, which allows us to see our meters as well. With a digital console, we have much more extensive metering capability. Hit the meter page, and we can see a lot of different readouts that show us our signal at different stages in the mixer. With an analog console, we're basically operating in a what you see is what you get type of a scenario. You push the controls up, and that's what's happening with the console. If you want to change something, you basically have to move those controls to make the change. With a digital console, we have the flexibility to store and recall all the different settings in the console, so we could save those as scenes or presets and instantly jump from one to the other. This allows you to, for example, have a preset that's set up for a particular band that's on stage and instantly switch to a different setup for a different band that might be coming on. Or you could use presets for different parts of songs. So that storage, that recall capability really extends the possibilities with a digital console. Most digital consoles also have more extensive effects and processing built in. For example, on the X32, we have a gate on each channel. We have a dynamics processor, basically a compressor on each channel. We have EQ, we have aux sends, we have multiple effects processors built in, and we can assign different effects to each of those processors. With an analog console, we may have no processing built in at all. Typically, we do have EQ and we have aux sends, but there may not be any onboard effects. In the case of this Z22 effects, we do have an effects processor with 16 different types of effects we can call up, and we can operate those using a single fader. But we don't have the multi-effects capability that we would have with a digital console. We don't have a compressor on each channel, and we don't have a gate on each channel. To access those types of effects, we'd use the insert jack and an external piece of hardware. One of the areas where digital mixers excel is with remote control. Oftentimes when you have a band on stage, they'll each want their separate mix, especially if they're using in-ear monitoring. In the case of a digital console, it's very easy to set things up so the front of house engineer is operating the main faders, but each musician can take charge of their own monitor mix using an iPad or other device. That's very difficult to do with an analog console. With an analog console, the front of house engineer will operate the faders, and generally they'll also be creating the monitor mixes using the aux sends. One other benefit with a digital console is typically there are more EQ capabilities on the aux sends and the master as well, and this is great for controlling feedback on stage. For example, you may be able to, depending on the model of digital mixer you're using, insert a graphic EQ onto each of the outputs. With an analog console, you may have master EQ or you may not. It depends on the console. One other benefit to a digital console is you may be able to use it as a control surface for your DAW when you're recording in your studio, and then take the console out and use it as a mixer live as well. So it can serve double duty for you both in your studio and live. An analog console can of course also be used in the studio and on stage, and it gives you very fast access and easy routing for setting things up with your DAW, but it doesn't give you that remote control or control surface over your DAW. Depending on the model of mixer you have, there are other differences as well between analog consoles and digital consoles. Some analog consoles may even have automation capabilities. Many digital consoles offer that as well. It just varies from model to model, but these basics are going to be the same. What it really comes down to is that an analog console is very easy to use and it's very easy to learn. And this is very important if you're in, for example, a worship situation where you may have multiple volunteers all using the same console. A digital mixer is going to have a bit more of a learning curve. You're going to have to sit down and figure out the routing, figure out the different pages, and maybe set up those presets in advance so that it's going to be easier to use for your different volunteers and people who are coming in. Regardless of which type of mixer you choose, digital or analog, the sound quality is going to be fantastic, and the results can be equally fantastic using both types. It's just how you get there that's different. I hope this tour through some of the features and benefits offered by analog and digital consoles help you narrow down your choices so you can select the proper console for your live rig or your studio system. If you have questions, contact your Sweetwater Sales Engineer or visit sweetwater.com. We'll be happy to help. I'm Mitch Gallagher from Sweetwater.